Okay, so the last type of tissue that we're going to study is going to be muscle and nerve. We don't do too much with it, but we do talk about the different types of muscle tissue, the skeletal, cardiac, or smooth, and then kind of a generalized view of nerve cells. All right, muscle tissue. So muscle tissue, it's specialized to contract, essentially. And it actually shortens each the little contractile units in the muscle along the length of it shorten to produce movement. Muscle cells are really long. They're really long, and we actually refer to them as muscle fibers. Okay, actually, one muscle fiber really is a muscle cell because the cell has these weird fibers, and they use them to contract. You can kind of see, like when you eat your chicken, the chicken's a little bit stringy, and there's like little fibers in there. Those are the really long muscle tissue, especially the skeletal muscle. When you're eating like a chicken thigh or leg. So skeletal muscle is the first type of muscle tissue that we're going to talk about. And its description is long cylindrical, like we talked about, sort of symmetrical. And one weird thing is it's multinucleated. So it has multiple nuclei in the cell. In fact, they don't really do mitosis, regular mitosis. It goes through the steps of mitosis, but it leaves out cytokinesis. Yeah, so they stay connected. And that's good because you want the whole muscle to contract. You want to make sure that they're kind of like sharing that contraction signal down the muscle fibers. Okay, so we have some picture here. You can see that the tissue, the cells for starters, they're all parallel and they're pretty close to the same thickness. They're long cylindrical. Yeah, each one of these is a muscle fiber. So, like one cell. Yeah. And then the nuclei, you can kind of see a little bit in the picture. It's harder to see. I could still see it on my copy here, but yeah, those are the nuclei that are kind of shoved to one side. And over in this cartoon, kind of three-dimensional drawing here of the muscle tissue, those are supposed to be the nuclei. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like three-dimensionally, and individual cylinders of muscles that are bundled together in like fascicles and such. Okay, so this is skeletal muscle. All right, and then the striated appearance is because muscle tissue is it all lines up. It all tries to be coordinated. It tries to go in the same direction so that we can have like fine motor movement and fine control. And we don't because we don't want it moving different directions. We usually want it one direction. Then you can kind of combine it with other movements. So the contractile units all line up and gives the muscle tissue a striated or striped appearance. And then it has to have a good blood supply because you need oxygen, you need nutrients so that we can contract and keep contracting. And yeah, so muscle tissue is usually pretty well uh, supplied with blood. Those are capillaries that are kind of running through there, and you can't really see it because our cross section here on the microscope sides are like in within these bundles. Okay, but good blood supply. All right, so we'll just say these are the capillaries, and they give it a good blood supply. Yeah, blood supply is good. Okay, its location. Yeah, it's going to be attached to bone or other connective tissue and or yeah, and a lot of times it'll be attached to could like if it's your mouth that's smiling and the muscle that's attached to the corners of your mouth, that's like the connective tissue of the skin the muscles are attached to, and they originate though from maybe your zygomatic bone, or your other jaw bones in your face. So you can smile. It's voluntary. So you're thinking about doing it and then you do it. So it's not like something happens and you're like, whoa, I didn't know that was going to happen. I mean, generally voluntary. I mean, we do have spinal reflexes, like jumping back when something's hot, but that's skeletal muscle. Its function, so it's voluntary movement, but the voluntary movement that's involved could be locomotion. Okay. Manipulation. So I guess, just being able to like take things in your hand and like write your notes. We talked a little bit about that. Smiling could be, facial expressions, it's a form of communication, and that's good too. Also, your vocal cords. You have to be able to make the sort of stretch them and manipulate the vocal cords. Okay, so we'll say speech could be communication. Also, heat. Do you know that's where your body heat comes from? Is your muscles? Yeah. So anyway, the next type of tissue that we're going to study is cardiac muscle. We'll go back and study skeletal muscle more in depth and how it functions, and we'll study the heart a little more in depth. But for now, I just need you to recognize the difference between this tissue and kind of the general function. The cardiac muscle tissue, you might notice, has its striations like skeletal, but it is not in long cylindrical cells. They're branched, all right? They seem to branch, and I think that kind of makes sense because you don't want your heart to just contract and shorten in one way. It wouldn't necessarily squeeze the blood through. So you need the blood, the signal and the contraction to start from one end of the heart and kind of go from the atrium to the ventricle, and it's got to go around the cavities there that house the blood. So it can make sense that it wouldn't just be straight line, I think. Also, it's got some interesting, these dark black lines, and this is helping sort of propagate and transmit and magnify the signal to contract so that your heart will make sure it has coordinated contracting all at once. So make sure that when it wants to contract the atrium, it's going to make sure it goes all the way from the atrium to the ventricle. Okay, so cardiac muscle. So its description is striped or striated. It is not multinucleated. Oh, that's another thing. So you didn't see a lot of dots of nuclei in the same cell, sort of, or the same fiber. So it is uninucleated. They're branched. That's another way you can tell that it's cardiac. And they communicate at these, what we call intercalated discs. Here. Make sure I spell that. Good. Okay, and that's what those dark lines are here in the cartoon drawing and here. And we've just kind of pulled the cell apart, like, in the cartoon three-dimensional drawing of this. And so you can see that the cells kind of like, they're not flat where they meet. I guess they're a little bumpy. And that makes sure that the signal gets propagated and it goes all the way through the tissue, through the whole heart. You want the whole heart to contract, not at the same time. You want it to be timed, but you don't want you don't want to do anything half-hearted, especially pump the blood. Okay, location, walls of the heart. So I think I decided to use blue for that. By the way, it does have a good blood supply. It does have its own coronary arteries. Yeah. So coronary arteries go down to, of course, capillaries, supply blood. So it's a good blood supply. And if those coronary arteries get clogged that actually feed the muscle tissue itself, then the heart senses it's not getting enough oxygen and goes, oh no, we must pump more blood. So then the heart starts working faster and harder. Unfortunately, that burns up more oxygen and causes there to be more of an oxygen deficit, which again the heart's sensing and then trying to pump more. So that's what causes that heart attack, that escalating positive feedback mechanism that's not so positive, causing myocardial infarction. That's aka heart attack. Let's see. Very good blood supply. Yes. Involuntary. We did need to mention that it's involuntary. Okay, so maybe I'll put that at the function here. Yeah, so it's weird to me too that the heart does not get most of its blood supply from its own blood because it's got too many cells lining the cavities of the atrium and the ventricle to ensure that the blood goes through and doesn't clot. Lots of smooth, maybe simple squamous epithelial tissue and some connective tissue there, and those tissue actually keep going and line arteries and other vessels. So it doesn't get blood or doesn't get oxygen from the blood that it's pumping necessarily. You have to have the coronary arteries that supplies the blood to the heart tissue. So location, let's say walls of the heart. Okay. Okay, so it's function. It's involuntary. It's also rhythmic. I guess that could be more of a description. Yeah, so it's kind of used to once there's been a signal and it depolarizes, repolarizes, it knows it's going to depolarize again. In fact, it has its own AV nodes. Your heart will try to pump on its own if it can. Your brain stem sends nerve signals to regulate your heart rate and maybe change it if there's danger or something too. So back to its function and involuntary. You're not thinking about pumping your own heart. Your heart just does it. Your heart will pump the blood into circulation, provides the blood pressure. Also, that blood pressure is necessary for your kidneys to function. It can't filter out your blood without the pressure behind there. So you need good blood pressure, but not too much, right? You don't want to blow out your capillaries and your kidneys. All right. I think that's all that we're going to say about that. We're actually going to go to smooth muscle next. There we go. Oh, try to line that up. Okay, so smooth muscle. Its appearance, I don't know if you noticed here, I probably can't tell super well from this picture, but it is spindle shaped. So the cartoon drawing is supposed to try to magnify that. All right, so these are each cell, by the way, it's back to uninucleated. Each cell kind of widens a little bit in the middle and tapers off at the end. So they're kind of like fit together there. They don't have the intercalated discs. They certainly don't, they aren't striated in appearance. They're not lined, all the contractile units are not lined up. So it's not as coordinated. It doesn't need to be, though. So spindle-shaped cells, just like we talked about, they form usually sheets. No striations, right? And I don't know if you saw that it was uninucleated. It's a funny word. Also, it's involuntary. I don't know. We put involuntary on function, didn't we? And I guess we need to say it's usually influenced and made to contract by hormones. Yeah. So instead of an electrical signal that you're sending through your nerves, like you do for skeletal muscle, and the heart responds to electrical or hormonal, smooth muscles generally hormonal. Okay. Mostly. So they respond to hormonal signals. And where's this at? Well, yeah, first let's say, by the way, the description, if you see it contract, it's a slower contraction. All right. And hormones are slow to kind of get in your bloodstream and get things happening. When you're digesting your food, you're not aware of it, so it's involuntary. Um, but you do need to be kind of resting. If you're in the resting state, if you're in the stress state, your system shuts off the signal for the heart or for the smooth muscles to contract. And there's a really good reason. If I talked about digesting, it's because the location of this is the walls of hollow organs like your stomach and your intestines. Okay, so maybe we want to put stomach, intestines, also your bladder. Yeah, when you really feel like you need to go, like right now, that's probably because your bladder contracted, because, like, oh, it's time to empty. When you go to the bathroom, usually your bladder contracts to empty it out. Also, another place where this is found is the iris of your eye, because if you're in a room that doesn't have very much light, you want it to be, you want the iris to be relaxed, so your pupil lets in more light. But then when you have a lot of light, you want your pupil to constrict because you're flooding your nerves with too much light, so that you can kind of regulate the light for your eye. So iris of your eye is where this is also found. By the way, the iris is the colored part, okay, and the pupil's the black part. It's actually hollow. Let's light in. So yeah, the involuntary contractions, hormone signals initiate. So I should say hormone signals initiate. It's pretty slow comparatively, and moves stuff, right? Moves chyme around in your stomach. So, by the way, your esophagus too is another one. I guess I needed to also put that. Moves food down your throat. I guess it could be chyme down your throat. I don't know. Chyme is partially digested food, right? Moves food down throat and into the stomach. Let's say through your esophagus. Okay. We'll study that more when we study the digestive system. Okay. Also, when we're talking the iris, it's going to regulate the amount of light. In your eye. Yeah, okay. So that's kind of where we're going with that. Just want you to be able to recognize the microscope slide that's got the smooth muscle, doesn't have any other kind of fibers visible. It's the muscle tissue itself in the cells that have the contractile units that make it shorten. And it makes sense that the smooth muscle wouldn't be super striated and lined up, because the intestines just kind of need to like squeeze, right? So it doesn't have to be unidirectional or one directional. Right? We're just kind of squeezing, and then the other part squeezes, and then the next part squeezes. That's what peristalsis is. It's just, like the wave in a stadium or something. Like it happens in waves. That's what peristalsis means. So we'll study that more later too when you do the digestive system. Nervous tissue then is going to be the last tissue that we study. We'll study it in depth when we go into the nervous system. But for just the overview of the tissue itself, you're going to be seeing nerve cells, which we also call neurons. They're highly specialized cells that receive and transmit electrochemical impulses. So it can get initiated by a chemical impulse, and it's going to propagate across the nerve cell chemically or electrically, really. And then it's going to dump out signals to cause chemical to be released and perhaps initiate more electrochemical impulse. So it really receives and transmits. It goes to and from all parts of your body. By the way, These cells do not undergo regular mitosis. Okay, back to muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue does mitosis pretty well. Your cardiac tissue only does mitosis 1% per year, approximately, even if there's damage. So when you damage your heart, your cardiac tissue, it does not recover very well. And that's why you have to protect your heart. And smooth muscle does a pretty good job of doing mitosis. Yeah, very good job. It's also good blood supply too, which we probably should mention that. Yeah. And you have a lot of capillaries that are going into your intestines to try to absorb nutrients from your intestines. Yeah, so you would have some pretty good blood supply for there. Okay, back to neurons. Neurons don't have a good blood supply, but we'll talk about that in a second. They don't usually do mitosis. There's a good reason for it, I guess. I mean, at a certain point in your life, before you're born, you have like most of your brain cells. Because if you like suddenly did mitosis and your neurons, they might lose connection with the learning that you have or your memory and like so you would forget things. You'd lose contact with that part of the brain if you just had mitosis happen. So your brain, before you're born, you have all the neurons that you're ever going to have, except for one more neuron growth when you're in about middle school, preteen, 10 to 12, and that's the frontal lobe. And that's growing directionally to the front. So if you wonder why middle school was so weird, it's because they had neurons popping up. And so if you walk to your car and you can't remember where you parked, maybe you did some mitosis there and lost that connection. Just kidding. That's not what happens. Okay. New connections between neurons are established, though, for the neurons we do have, and that's how we learn. So we just make more and new connections. So even if you learn a whole bunch of things in school and you're like, when am I ever going to use this? I'm never going to use this. Well, you use that neuron, you kept that neuron, and that neuron's available and more highly honed so that you'll be able to learn things in the future. So what you're doing now is great. It's good for your brain because you actually from the before you're even born, before even the day you were born, your brain is picking and choosing neurons that you didn't use at all and saying, well, we never use these. It is going to die. It kills its own brain. Yes, brain cells. So the brain cells you do use, your brain goes, oh, yeah, this one's used. Leave it alone. So yeah, if you don't learn enough things at a younger age, you could lose a little more neurons. So it's kind of a use it or lose it mentality. Your brain, that's why they say your brain's still developing up through age 25. It's because that process happens through age 25. So that's why they encourage kids to go to college and learn what they can now, because if you learn more now, you have more ability to learn later. Even if you've forgotten everything that you thought you learned. Maybe it's easier to remember too if you've already learned it once. So these cells, they establish connections, but there's about three main parts. Okay, this is, by the way, we say there's two major cell populations. There's the actual neurons themselves, and then the supporting cells, which we call neuroglia, which we'll talk about in a second, okay? But nerve cells themselves, the neurons, they have a cell body, which is drawn out into long processes that create the other structures, okay? And these long processes allow the cell to receive and transmit signals, okay? The axon is one process that that comes from the cell body. It's a sort of cytoplasm drawn out into a very long process called an axon. It carries information away from the body. And if this neuron has decided to transmit the signal, it'll go ahead and act on the axon and carry information to something else. Could be a muscle too. Could be telling a muscle to contract. Could be accessing information. Could be storing information. The last part are the dendrites. And they come directly from the cell body. There's a lot of them. And I always think of it this way, because if you could see the picture down here, this is the neuron, cell body. All right, here is the long drawn out axon, and there's something around it that we'll talk about in a second. All right. The signal gets received, though, from outside of the cell and into the dendrites. Okay, so the signal goes this way. So these are the dendrites receiving the signal to the cell body. The cell body actually decides whether to transmit the signal or not, if the signal's strong enough. And then the signal will go down the axon, and the axon does the acting on, and whatever, maybe it's stimulating the heart to contract or something, some action to be taken. So the dendrites, I always think of like dendrites as like the processes, like the antennas for the cell body, which would be like your head. And so I always think of like dendrites, they're like the dandruff coming from your head to receive signals. Okay, we'll study that a little more in depth later. But now we need to talk about the neuroglia, the supporting specialized cells that are always around central nervous system or peripheral nervous system. In this case, I believe this is like the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk more about the central nervous system, what happens there. Neuroglia, they all support and protect and insulate delicate neurons. Those cells do undergo mitosis, so they do repair themselves throughout their life. Okay, just not the neurons themselves. Okay. By the way, that picture of the microscope slide, when you see it, it'll look like a cell that's like drawn out into long processes, like a big star or something like that. There's the dendrites. Try to color code these. Yeah, and then you might see some nuclei, and those nuclei are the nuclei for the rest of the supporting cells. Okay, which we call neuroglia. I guess I could do that in red. So even though you see some black dots in the background, those are the neuroglia, that cells that support. What do they do? Well, good old Ollie, she's a oligodendrocyte, and she provides this coating here that you're seeing. That's actually like an insulation, like wiring needs insulation to transmit efficiently electrical signal. Well, so does your axon. Yeah, otherwise your signal might get short-circuited somewhere else and it won't propagate effectively, or might stimulate another neuron on accident. So yeah, we have to insulate your neurons so they can effectively communicate. So in your peripheral nervous system, it's called the oligodendrocyte. We have a different one in the central nervous system. And yeah, that's why fat is so important, because one of the uses of fats, of course, are in your cell membranes, your bilipid membrane, but also you need the fat that's being wrapped around here, because fat is not conductive, it's not polar, so it insulates. But if your body doesn't get enough fat, it's got no choice but to borrow it from somewhere if you've eaten it all up. You need fat in your eyes to keep your eyes forward, and so you can see beyond your eye orbitals. So other supporting cells, other neuroglia, are astrocytes, cleverly named after their star-shaped appearance, and they basically attach or serve as a go-between, really, and attach the blood vessels, capillaries, to the neurons, because the neurons do not have a direct blood supply. Okay, so maybe, I don't know if you want to say that somewhere. Neurons do not have a direct blood supply. And that's for a good reason. Sometimes we exercise, sometimes we mess around with our metabolism, and our blood could get a little toxic, or we could have toxins in the blood that need to be cleaned out of the system for whatever reason that we've been exposed to, or immune system or pathogens that your body's dealing with and needs to deal with. You don't want that directly going through your brain. So it's good to have this go-between astrocyte cell, which we'll study more in the central nervous system, and it gets the nutrients to the nerve cells and takes away waste to clean it out. Lastly, we have microglia, which are just named because they're so tiny, and they actually initiate immune system response. Remember, because your nerve cells are not directly attached to your blood supply, so it has to have the immune system response sort of initiated by another cell that's specialized to do so, called the microglia. All right. So, yeah, that's pretty close to a generalized neuron. It might look a little bit different depending on what its job is. But we have very long axons um, they go all the way from your spine, close to your spine, to your peripheral of your body. And we sometimes we have really long dendrites of receiving sensory neurons from your periphery to back to your spine, which is where all the neurons travel. But when you're, you know, doing dissection, when we talk about, and maybe you hit your funny bone and it gives you that shocking feeling because you stimulate a whole bunch of neurons, and it hurts. We call those nerves, but really what we're talking about is a bundle of axons and dendrites. Yeah, because they're not that big. All right, so if you what you call a nerve are really bundles of axons and dendrites. Okay, so and that keeps things organized too, and hopefully your surgeon can avoid cutting through those and causing some loss of sensation or function. All right, so yeah, this was pretty good. Just overview in general. We'll study more later. Thanks a lot. That rounds out our tissue unit. So you can make your flashcards out of these, practice the sites that I gave you to practice so that you can at least recognize the picture, maybe by the picture or maybe by the function too. And no, we're doing like 24 types of tissue, I think. That's a lot. Yeah. So you want to study those and just let me know if you have any questions on those. Okay, I appreciate you guys. Just take care. We'll talk to you soon.